Welcome to the History of European Theatre podcast, and thanks for joining me on this journey through millennia of theatrical history. Episode 192, Hamlet, Part 2, Something is Rotten in the State of Denmark. Last time I left things hanging for Hamlet as, having seen the ghost of his father and resolved on revenge, he had seen his planning go awry as he mistakenly killed the old councillor Polonius while he'd hid behind a wall hanging. We have seen Polonius's daughter Ophelia begin her descent into madness, Hamlet's school friends Rosencrantz and Guildenstern become embroiled in Hamlet's feigned madness, and Claudius prompted into a desire to pray, having seen the players perform a piece that replicated his actions in the manner of his brother's murder. Now that quick summary in no way does the play any sort of justice, so please do listen to the previous 2 episodes on Hamlet, my look at the first half of the play, and my conversation with Colin David Reese about the language in the play, if you've not done so already. I'll be here waiting for you when you get back. So let's pick up from where, following that murder and the berating of Gertrude, Hamlet has left, dragging the body of Polonius behind him. But before that, this is, I think, a good moment to consider Gertrude, widow of the King of Denmark and now wife to her former brother-in-law and Queen of Denmark. She has relatively few lines in the play, but fulfills an important part in it. Her hasty marriage to Claudius is a main theme in Hamlet's consideration of his position. A marriage to a dead husband's brother was considered incestuous at the time, but for the nobility, dispensations from the church could be conveniently granted, and, presumably, everybody remembered the similar pickle that Henry VIII got himself into, having married his dead brother's wife. But Gertrude seemed, initially at least, quite sanguine about her situation, and perhaps there were practical and political reasons for her to marry the new king in order to retain position and influence. She never reveals her motivations, but it seems likely that the image that Hamlet has of his parents' loving and close marriage may not be completely true. Gertrude positively encourages Hamlet not to mourn his father overmuch when she says, "Good Hamlet, cast thy nighted colour off, and let thine eye look like a friend on Denmark. Do not for ever with thy veiled lids seek for thy noble father in the dust. Thou know'st 'tis common, all that lives must die, passing through nature to eternity." When he comments that such grief is common, she challenges him with, "Why seems it so particular with thee?" And he responds, "Seems, madam? Nay, it is, I know not, seems. 'Tis not alone my inky cloak, good mother, nor customary suits of solemn black, nor windy suspiration of forced breath, no, nor the fruitful river in the eye, nor the dejected haviour of the visage, together with all forms, moods, shapes of grief that can denote me truly. These indeed seem, for they are actions that a man might play, but I have that within which passes show, these but the trappings and the suits of woe." He singularly ignores her advice, which sends him further into viewing his mother with contempt. It also leads to his next soliloquy, "Oh, that this too sullied flesh would melt," which I quoted in the first episode on the play, where he links his general unhappiness in life with his mother's remarriage. Even though the ghost has warned him off harming Gertrude, he seriously considers how much she knew of the murder of the old king and approaches her aggressively in the closet scene. For all this threat, she does appear to be genuinely concerned for the well-being of her son, and events at the end of the play show that she was not involved in the murder of her first husband. Whatever we might think about her lack of ability to see Claudius for what he is, one of her important roles in the play is to provide some very pithy commentary on Hamlet's actions throughout, and we do get a sense of a mother torn between unconditional love for her son and his increasingly odd behaviour. The pairing of Ophelia and Gertrude in the play continues a pattern that Shakespeare had been following over his recent plays. The names of the 2 boy actors who played the female roles in the company are unfortunately lost to history, but Shakespeare clearly considered them capable of performing significant roles, one taking the older, more experienced women, and in the comedies the romantic lead, with the other taking a mix of older and younger women. So the boys playing Gertrude and Ophelia had also played Calpurnia and Portia in Julius Caesar, Catherine of France and her maid Alice in Henry V, and Beatrice and Hero in Much Ado About Nothing. and all of these in the space of a year or so. Then came Rosalind and Celia in As You Like It, and these female roles in Hamlet. More strong female roles were to come. The necessary skills of these young players came at a time when there was generally a revival in interest in boy playing troupes. In 1599, the boy players at St Paul's resumed public performances after a long hiatus, and a boy troupe moved into the Blackfriars Theatre, which had lain unused since the Burbages' attempt to open it with the Queen's Men failed due to local opposition. The Burbages must have been grateful for the income that subletting the Blackfriars gave them, but it also meant that competition for the battle for audiences was tough for the playing companies. The threat from the boys' companies is even referred to in Hamlet, when Hamlet asks Rosencrantz if the players have become rusty, and he says, "Nay, their endeavour keeps in the wonted pace, but there is, sir, and eyrie of children, little essays that cry out at the top of a question, and are most tyrannically clapped for't. These are now the fashion, and so berattle the common stages, so they call them, that many wearing rapiers are afraid of goose quills, and dare scarce come thither." To which Hamlet responds, "What, are they children? Who maintains them? How are they escoted? Will they pursue the quality no longer than they can sing? Will they not say afterwards, if they should grow themselves to common players, as it is most like, if their means are no better, their writers do them wrong to make them exclaim against their own succession?" And Rosencrantz replies, "Faith, there has been much to do on both sides, and the nation holds it no sin to tar them to controversy. There was for a while no money bid for argument, unless the poet and the player went to cuffs in the question." It sounds like the rise of the children's companies was seen as a real problem for the adult players, and part of Shakespeare's response was to make very good use of his own younger players. But let's get back to the play. Gertrude tells Claudius of the death of Polonius, and he sends Rosencrantz and Guildenstern to find Hamlet, who refuses to reveal where he has left the body, and only tells that to Claudius once he's been told that he will be sent to England. Once he has gone, Claudius reveals that he will send sealed letters with Hamlet, asking the English to kill the bearer. As Hamlet makes his way to the coast, he encounters Fortinbras and his army on their way to Poland. The scene reminds us of the close proximity of Fortinbras and his army, but also serves to strengthen Hamlet's resolve as he admires the determination of Fortinbras. Back at court, Gertrude hears that Ophelia has gone mad. She sees the unfortunate young woman for herself, and Claudius agonises over the disruption that the death of Polonius and the return of Laertes has caused. There is a real sense that Claudius's position is politically insecure. Events at court have clearly caused public unrest, which is further inflamed by the return of Laertes from France, having been told of the death of his father. Just in case we had forgotten, Shakespeare is reminding us that these events are not just the tragedy of a family, but of a nation, and that this began with the murder of a king and the usurping of his throne. Actions have consequences and, just as we saw in Julius Caesar, these are not predictable. Claudius has disrupted the status quo, and as we've seen before in every play of Shakespeare's, whatever the genre, the status quo is always the preferred state. Before Laertes enters, Ophelia's songs of death and betrayal haunt the scene. As she leaves, the return of Laertes is heralded by the sound of an angry crowd at the door of the chamber, making the threat to Claudius very real. Claudius manages to persuade Laertes that he is innocent in the matter of Polonius's death. Ophelia re-enters, now obviously quite deranged, in a frighteningly calm sort of way, leaving Laertes disturbed and concerned for her. Horatio receives a letter that tells of how Hamlet's ship to England was attacked by pirates who took him prisoner, and that now he has come back to Denmark. Hamlet has also written to Claudius, telling of his return. Claudius plots with Laertes to stage a fencing match with Hamlet, where the tip of a blade will be poisoned, thereby killing him. As a backup plan, Claudius will have a poisoned cup of wine ready. As they plot, Gertrude returns with the news that Ophelia has drowned. As Hamlet makes his way back to court, he meets a gravedigger, singing as he works. He reflects on the bones that are being dug up, including the skull of the former king's court jester Yorick. He sees a funeral procession approaching and realises that it is Ophelia who is about to be buried. Laertes, consumed with grief, jumps into the grave, cursing Hamlet. When Hamlet reveals himself, they scuffle, with Hamlet protesting that he did love Ophelia and also grieves for her. Hamlet tells Horatio how he opened the king's letters and discovered that he was to be killed by the English, and how he returned the letters to Rosencrantz and Guildenstern, meaning that they will now be murdered. Osric, a courtier, enters requesting Hamlet partake in the fencing bout that Claudius has arranged. Warily he agrees. Osric is one of those minor but quite important characters that Shakespeare excelled at. For the plot, he is there to issue the challenge to the fencing bout and to referee it, but with his flowery language he is also a foil for Hamlet to mock. The contemporary audience would have seen him as the sort of superficial courtier who was there to be laughed at. This is a satiric portrait of courtly behaviour, and reminds us of the fact that many in the court are not what they seem, and neither are their intentions. We could go as far as to say that Osric's assessment of the court also represents the moral decay of those in the upper echelons of power. For example, he says of Laertes, Hamlet's opponent in the bout, "Sir, here is newly come to court Laertes. Believe me, an absolute gentleman, full of most excellent differences, of very soft society, and great showing. Indeed, to speak freely of him, he is the card or calendar of gentry. For you shall find him the continent of what part a gentleman would see." Which is hardly correct or honest, but it seems doubtful that Osric is being deliberately duplicitous. He's more likely an innocent caught up in events that he doesn't really understand. As Hamlet and Laertes fence, Gertrude drinks from the poisoned cup. Laertes wounds Hamlet with the poisoned rapier. A fierce fight follows, where the swords become swapped, and Hamlet wounds Laertes with the poisoned sword. As Gertrude dies, Laertes reveals his and Claudius's part in the plot to kill Hamlet. Hamlet kills Claudius with his sword. Laertes dies from poison, as does Hamlet, but not before he tells Horatio to relate what has happened to Fortinbras, who has his support as the new king of Denmark. Fortinbras arrives and, seeing the stage strewn with bodies, claims the crown and orders a military funeral for Hamlet. With that ending, and with much of what has gone before it, it is difficult to disagree with critics who see the main concern of the play as being with death. The story of the play has its roots in a competition of single combat between two kings. Then there is the murder of a king by his brother, all of which happens before the opening of the play proper. By the end of the dramatised action, Horatio stands with 4 bodies within his reach and with 5 others elsewhere, that he does not forget as he summarises the scene for Fortinbras and the English ambassadors. But since, so jump upon this bloody question, you from the Polack wars and you from England are here arrived, give order that these bodies high on a stage be placed to the view, and let me speak to the yet unknowing world how these things came about. So shall you hear of carnal, bloody and unnatural acts, of accidental judgments, casual slaughters, of deaths put on by cunning and forced cause, and, in this upshot, purposes mistook, fallen on the inventors' heads, and this can I truly deliver. So although Hamlet's remains are to be treated honourably, there is no honour in the transpired events. Shakespeare, through Horatio, portrays this rather as the wickedness and folly of mankind writ large. So, all pointless and a waste of time? Well, hardly. For me, and I think for most people, we come away from seeing the play somewhat wrung out emotionally, having found it an exciting, dramatic and, overall, a positive experience. And we each have a different perspective on the rights and wrongs of the characters and their beliefs. Hamlet, of course, dominates the play, but he is no confident, outgoing hero. He does not stride onto the stage like any of Shakespeare's kings, or Caesar or Brutus. What we see first is reluctance and passivity towards the events that have happened to him. Certainly, he is quietly resentful of his uncle and his mother, but apparently not that suspicious of his father's death. Indeed, melancholy through grief are the attributes that are often assigned to him, and that is one possible explanation for his behaviour. It is only with the ghostly appearance of his late father that he is turned to a need for revenge, and past events start to fall into place for him. He is reluctant to believe the ghost is real, and even when convinced, he is still slow to act. His resolve is questionable until as late as Act 4 of the play, when he finally declares, "Oh, from this time forth my thoughts be bloody or be nothing worth." We have to accept that Hamlet is by nature a scholarly prince, a man of thought and philosophy. In this way, he is very different from the typical heroes or anti-heroes of revenge tragedies. They tend to be men of action, given to quick and decisive decisions, with plans thrown together that lead to excessive bloodshed. Killings in other revenge tragedies are typically much more gratuitous and deliberately shown to be cruel and, well, bloody. Deaths in Hamlet are either reported from offstage, hidden behind a curtain, or a succession of rapier thrusts. Assuming that Gertrude does not linger over her death, then none of these deaths lend themselves to the obvious and intentional bloodletting of other plays. Dramatisations that must have required bucket loads of theatrical blood backstage. Hamlet is revenge tragedy for sure, but still a very different sort of play from the others in the genre. What seems to distract Hamlet from his purpose is his tendency to linger on fundamental questions of the problems of human existence. It seems he cannot help himself in this respect, but we might think that this is at least in part because of his melancholy state. His ruminations on life are very dark, which is not surprising, as he is in the middle of a grieving process. If we accept that he is depressed, having lost his father and quite possibly his birthright, that he has been victimised by fate and then more or less instructed to take revenge that will probably damn his own soul, we just might forgive him for being less than courageous and determined. But also, Hamlet does genuinely have to be cautious. Only he knows that Claudius killed his father, and this information was given to him by a source that could be, well, unreliable at best, and quite possibly malevolent. This alone is surely reason enough for delay. There's also the suggestion later that Hamlet is a popular figure among the people of Denmark, when Claudius tries to explain why he is sending Hamlet to England. That might seem unlikely given Hamlet's contemplative nature, but again, perhaps before his father's death and being overcome by grief, he was a different sort of person. His liking of and affinity with the players would suggest this is the case. One might be concerned that by killing a king, one's popularity might be lost, and perhaps Hamlet knows that the Danish people are less than constant, a point proven by their flocking to support Laertes on his return in the wake of the murder of his father. The Hamlet who is capable of carrying out revenge is not really present until Act 5 in the penultimate scene of the play. It is in the moment when he hears Laertes cursing him from Ophelia's grave that he says, "What is he whose grief bears such an emphasis, whose phrase of sorrow conjures the wandering stars and makes them stand like wonder-wounded hearers? This is I, Hamlet the Dane." That definitive moment of self-assertion comes in the graveyard with all the overtones of death that it could convey, but no matter, Hamlet has changed and his journey is now all but over. And we will come back to this very important scene again. As much as the interpretations of Hamlet and his motivations vary, we can identify him as a very particular sort of tragic hero. He does not have one tragic flaw that leads to his decisions and demise. He is not prideful, greedy, lustful, jealous or hubristic at the expense of all other traits. Indeed, he doesn't really display some of those typical traits at all. Rather, he is highly intelligent, has insightful feelings and emotions, and, for all his delaying, shows an almost superhuman amount of willpower. These attributes all play their part in his downfall, but cannot be separated within his character. The attributes that cause his downfall are much more nuanced and complex than is typical for plays in this genre. Another suggestion has been that Hamlet actually has an underlying desire to die, born from his depressed state and grief. We hear even before he sees the ghost that he has withdrawn from life, and it is soon clear that he is obsessed with death and suicide. From that base, the revelations of the ghost only intensify his sense of loss, and for the rest of the play he goes on to lose friendship, family and love. Clinically speaking, his process of mourning has been stopped, and he becomes trapped in a death obsession that has an almost inevitable ending. That is, I think, a particularly dark reading of his character, but certainly worth considering. It is undeniable that the central imagery of the play is of disease, corruption, death and mortality. With the overriding purpose being to show the corruption of the Danish court and Hamlet's state of mind, images such as the unweeded garden and sullied flesh leave us in no doubt that indeed something is rotten in the state of Denmark. The idea of physical decay, through many references to ulcers, sores, cankers and pestilence, is also ever present. Inevitably, that leads to thoughts of death and mortality, and of course no discussion of this play is complete without mention of Yorick's skull. So let's go back to that famous graveyard scene. Although it comes towards the end of the play, the 19th of the 20 scenes that make up the drama, it is very significant dramatically and thematically. At this point, we haven't seen Hamlet since his encounter with the army of Fortinbras as he made his way to the coast and a ship for England. This was 3 scenes ago, and in the interim, Ophelia has gone mad and died, and Claudius has commenced his plotting with Laertes. All is set for the showdown, and at this stage our sympathies are most likely with Hamlet, as we have followed the surprising account of his escape from certain death at the hands of the unexpected band of pirates. But again, Shakespeare chooses to shake things up a bit and introduce some new characters and some dark comedy. 2 gravediggers engage in some grim banter. Take the opening lines for example, where the first gravedigger says Ophelia is a suicide and therefore should not be buried in consecrated ground. As he says, is she to be buried in Christian burial when she wilfully seeks her own salvation? And the other replies, I tell thee she is, therefore make her grave straight. The crowner hath sat on her and finds it Christian burial. The first gravedigger considers this for a moment and then says, how can that be unless she drowned herself in her own defence? The dark humour of the graveyard indeed. That kind of witticism continues when Hamlet and Horatio enter and engage with the gravediggers. This is Hamlet's exasperated response to their wordplay. How absolute the knave is! We must speak by the card, or equivocation will undo us. By the Lord, Horatio, these 3 years I have took note of it. The age is grown so pickled that the toe of the peasant comes so near the heel of the courtier, he galls his kibe. This serves to remind us of the troubled and corrupt times out of kilter with accepted norms, and this leads directly to the gravedigger's remembrance of the old king and better times now past. At the end of those lines about the feet of peasants and courtiers, the kibe was an ulcerated chilblain that appeared on the heel of the foot. This reminiscing and the uncovering of Yorick's skull lead to more remembrance of better times and to one of the most quoted and misquoted speeches from the play. As Hamlet says, taking the skull, let me see. Alas, poor Yorick, I knew him, Horatio, a fellow of infinite jest, of most excellent fancy. He hath borne me on his back 1,000 times, and now how abhorred in my imagination it is. My gorge rises at it. Here hung these lips that I have kissed, I know not how oft. Where be your gibes now, your gambols, your songs, your flashes of merriment that were wont to set the table on a roar? Not one now to mock your own grinning, quite chapfallen. Now, get you to my lady's chamber, and tell her, let her paint an inch thick. To this favour she must come. Make her laugh at that. Chapfallen there means to have the lower jaw hanging loosely through exhaustion or dejection. Perhaps Hamlet sees his own state in the almost disconnected jaw of the skull. The following line emphasises the inevitability of death and decay. However much ageing may be hidden by make-up, even when applied an inch thick, we will all end up like this skull, rotting in the ground. But our feelings for Hamlet, our sympathies and our enjoyment at his cleverness take a turn, I would suggest, when he realises that Ophelia is dead by her own hand, but thanks to his machinations, and he enters into what looks like a grieving competition with Laertes. Do we really believe now that he loved Ophelia as he claims to? Given the way he has treated and used her, that really is a very big ask. In this scene, we also see the main characters together for the first time, albeit that Ophelia is only there as a presence representing so much of what has been lost through the actions of others. Commentators have suggested that this scene represents the whole play, as the friendship of the two gravediggers mirrors that of Hamlet and Horatio. Hamlet's wit is again on display, alongside his melancholy ruminations, and with Claudius, Gertrude, Laertes and Ophelia all being present. The scene is also admired for the way Shakespeare draws us into it. As an audience, we are watching Hamlet and Horatio spying on the gravediggers before they engage with them, and seeing Ophelia's funeral from afar before becoming embroiled in it. We are drawn slowly in and, some have suggested, pulled deliberately towards sympathising with Hamlet again before the brawl with Laertes over the grave finally sets us against him. By now, some critics feel, we are happy enough for the end of the play, which rids us of these distasteful characters, Hamlet included. Personally, I think the end of the play, however bloody and brutal, is much more subtle than that interpretation suggests. For sure, Hamlet gives us no easy answers to the questions raised. How could it? But it does investigate those questions, and perhaps what the graveyard scene really does is to balance those with a realistic view of what death is and what it can mean. Although we don't have detailed records of early performances apart from mentions that the play was performed at court in 1619 and 1637, and the blurb on the first page of the first quarto edition that says it was performed in the City of London and at the universities of Cambridge and Oxford and elsewhere, it is the play that is mentioned most by other writers, diarists and the like in their work, so it seems that it was very popular from the start. Richard Burbage was almost certainly the first Hamlet, and we know that the role was taken over by Joseph Taylor when Burbage died in 1619, another indication that it was still firmly in the repertoire of the King's Men at that time. During the interregnum, it survived only as The Droll of the Gravemakers, and was then revised by Davenant at the Restoration, being one of the Shakespeare plays assigned to his company. Thomas Betterton took on the role of Hamlet in 1641 and played it for the next 40 years until his death. Through subsequent periods, just about every leading male actor has had a crack at the role, from Garrick to Olivier, Gielgud and Branner. There really are too many to mention and particularly highlight. There have also been many female interpretations of the role, the first being by Sarah Siddons, but perhaps most famously by Sarah Bernhardt. Of all of Shakespeare's plays, Hamlet is notable for its worldwide impact, where since the 19th century it has been frequently performed in Europe, particularly in France, Germany and Scandinavia, but also there have been many notable performances in North America. The influence of Hamlet on Western culture has been so all-pervasive that it is impossible to sum up its performance history. Indeed, many volumes have been written on that subject alone. Just within theatre, its success prompted something of a revival in the revenge tragedy form, with perhaps Middleton's Revenger's Tragedy being the most obvious example. So rather than mentioning individual productions and performances, we might more generally say that in the 18th century Hamlet was played as a more decisive character than in the Romantic and Victorian periods, where he was seen as a complex idealist unable to cope with the brutalities of his time, and his indecisiveness became highlighted. That trend continued into the 20th century, but alongside this, the influence of Freudian and other psychoanalytical techniques were brought to bear on the character. Therefore, in the last century or so, we have seen many different interpretations of Hamlet's character and motivations, with a lot of them being quite unsympathetic to the character and his reaction to his situation. On film, there was an early 5-minute French version in 1900, and film adaptations have followed since then at regular intervals, silently in 1913 and 1920, and then a sound version called To Be or Not to Be in 1924. Then, of course, there was Laurence Olivier's famous 1948 film. Olivier, who was aged 40 at the time, starred and directed in the film, which showed the prince as a lonely and isolated character, locked into a nostalgia for the past, which perhaps reflected the mood in post-war Europe. Tony Richardson's 1969 version of his theatre production is more cinematic than Olivier's, but it was Franco Zeffirelli's 1990 version with Mel Gibson and Glenn Close that put the story into truly cinematic form. That film runs to a heavily cut 2 hours and 15 minutes and only uses about 35% of the original text. Zeffirelli's stated intention was to attract a younger audience, and his casting, cuts and short scene filming style reflected that. In view of this, and perhaps inevitably, the film had a mixed reception with critics, but it did do well enough at the box office. The award for the fullest version on film must go to Kenneth Branagh's 1996 monumental effort. For this, he used the first folio text in uncut form and with some additional text from the second quarto. The full edit runs to 4 hours, but there was a reduced-length version released that ran for 2.5 hours. Sadly, despite 4 Oscar nominations, some commercial and yet still interesting casting, and generally positive reviews, the film did not do well at the box office. It did, however, spawn a video game, probably the first one to be created based on Shakespeare. It's called Hamlet, a Murder Mystery, and uses shots from the film to allow players to wander through Elsinore Castle in search of the murderer while solving puzzles. The list of other works inspired by Hamlet is also way too long to run through here, but from books and films taking the story from Ophelia's point of view to the myriad of works that have taken quotes from the play as their title or inspiration, and then through to Disney's Lion King, the artistic inspiration taken from the play would make a family tree that just keeps getting bigger and bigger. For all that Hamlet is rightly praised for its use of dramatic and poetic techniques, and how these are used to convey story and establish character, it is also still a play where the audience are carried along and inevitably get caught up in the action, and a desire to know what happens next and ultimately who will survive. We may not find that we like Hamlet as a person very much, but we are fascinated by his journey and his thoughts on the experiences of his life, and there seems no reason to think that it will ever stop fascinating audiences in years to come. Next time, we will conclude this tour through Hamlet with more thoughts from Colin David Reese, particularly on the character of Polonius, and after that, we return to the work of Ben Jonson. In the meantime, if you've not done so already, please join the Facebook page or group, or find the podcast on Instagram or Blue Sky just to keep up to date with new episodes and other theatre-related things. If you do feel able to help out with the costs of running the podcast, then please head on over to Patreon, where you will find additional content for a small monthly fee or a one-off donation for selected episodes. You can also make a one-off show of support through Ko-fi.com. I look forward to your company next time, but if you have any comments or concerns in the meantime, you can contact me by email at thoetp@gmail.com or through the website, where you can leave me a voice message by clicking on the microphone icon, or you can write to me on the contact page. That's all at www.thehistoryofeuropeantheatre.com.